The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Queen Camilla stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses that had been her late mother-in-law's pride and joy. The weight of the crown she now wore felt heavier today than it had in months. In her trembling hands, she held a letter that would change everything. The letter bore the official seal of the Palace Council, and its contents had been debated in hushed whispers throughout the corridors of power for weeks. As she read the words for the third time that morning, Camilla felt her heart sink deeper into her chest. The royal family was preparing to release a statement about her future role, and it wasn't the affirmation she had hoped for. Charles had been gone for 2 months now, taken by a swift illness that had shocked the nation. The transition of power had been seamless in the public eye, but, behind closed doors, the royal machinery was grinding with uncertainty. Camilla had expected to step into her role as Queen Mother with dignity and purpose, but the letter suggested a different path entirely. Lady Margaret Thornbury, the Queen's private secretary, knocked softly on the door before entering. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern as she approached the window where Camilla stood motionless. "Your Majesty," Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper, "the Palace Council is gathering in the blue drawing room. They're expecting your presence in an hour." Camilla turned from the window, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She had weathered public storms before, endured decades of scrutiny and judgment, fought for her place in this ancient institution. This would be no different, she told herself, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. The walk to the blue drawing room felt like a march to the gallows. Each step echoed through the marble hallways, past portraits of queens who had faced their own trials and tribulations. Queen Victoria's stern gaze seemed to follow her, as if passing judgment on this woman who had married into duty rather than being born to it. Inside the drawing room, 12 members of the Palace Council sat around an oval mahogany table that had witnessed countless historical decisions. Lord Pemberton, the Lord Chamberlain, cleared his throat as Camilla took her seat at the head of the table. The silence was suffocating. "Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton began, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of protocol, "we have called this meeting to discuss the statement that will be released regarding your future role within the royal family structure." Camilla straightened her shoulders, drawing upon reserves of strength she had cultivated through years of public service. "I assume this discussion involves more than mere formalities, Lord Pemberton." "Indeed, Your Majesty. The Council has been reviewing the constitutional implications of your position, particularly in light of the new king's wishes to modernize certain aspects of the monarchy." The new king. Her stepson, William, now wore the crown that had passed from his grandfather to his father and, now to him. The transition had been swift, almost brutal in its efficiency. William was a good man, Camilla knew, but he carried the weight of his mother's memory and the expectations of a nation that still questioned Camilla's legitimacy. Lady Sarah Fitzwilliam, one of the younger members of the council, leaned forward. "Your Majesty, the proposed statement would establish a new precedent. Rather than maintaining your current role, we are suggesting a transition to a position of elder stateswoman of the Commonwealth, with residency shifting to Scotland." The words hit Camilla like a physical blow. Scotland. Beautiful, remote Scotland, where she could tend gardens and host small gatherings, far from the center of royal life. It was exile dressed in velvet gloves, banishment wrapped in respectful language. "I see," Camilla managed, her voice steady despite the earthquake occurring within her chest. "And this decision has been made without my consultation?" Lord Pemberton shuffled his papers uncomfortably. "Your Majesty, the decision comes with the highest respect for your years of service. The new king feels that this transition would allow the monarchy to realign with contemporary expectations while honoring your contribution to the crown." Contemporary expectations. The phrase was a dagger wrapped in diplomatic language. After decades of proving herself, of transforming from the most hated woman in Britain to a respected member of the royal family, she was being asked to step aside for the sake of public opinion polls and focus group results. Margaret, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may, the statement is not yet finalized. There is still time for adjustments." Hope flickered in Camilla's chest like a candle flame in the wind. Margaret had been her ally through the darkest days, the woman who had helped craft the careful rehabilitation of her public image. If anyone understood the delicate machinery of royal communications, it was Margaret.
What kind of adjustments? Camilla asked, though she dreaded the answer.
The council is prepared to offer alternatives, Lady Fitzwilliam interjected.
A gradual transition, perhaps.
Reduced public duties over the next year, followed by the Scottish residency arrangement.
Gradual transition. Reduced duties.
Each phrase was another stone in the wall being built between her and the life she had fought so hard to claim. Camilla thought of Charles, of the promises they had made to each other about facing whatever challenges came their way together. Now she was alone, surrounded by well-meaning courtiers who saw her as a problem to be managed rather than a queen to be honored. The meeting continued for another hour, with various council members outlining the logistics of the proposed transition. There would be a gracious statement about her desire to focus on charitable work in Scotland. The public would be told she was choosing a quieter life after years of faithful service. The narrative would be one of voluntary retirement rather than forced exile. As the sun began to set outside the tall windows of the blue drawing room, Camilla found herself thinking about her grandchildren.
How would they understand this decision? Would they see it as their step-grandmother choosing to leave, or would they eventually learn the truth about the careful political calculations that were reshaping their family?
When the meeting finally concluded, Camilla remained seated as the council members filed out, offering respectful bows and promises to await her decision. Lord Pemberton paused at the door. "Your Majesty, I hope you understand that this recommendation comes from a place of deep respect for your service to the Crown. The transition to Scotland would allow you to maintain your dignity while giving the new king the space he needs to establish his reign."
Dignity.
The word tasted bitter in Camilla's mouth. She had spent years building her dignity, brick by careful brick, through charity work and public service, through small kindnesses and large gestures of support for the institution she had married into. Now that dignity was being offered to her as a consolation prize for accepting exile. After the last council member departed, Margaret approached the table where Camilla still sat, staring at her hands.
"Your Majesty, you don't have to accept their recommendation immediately.
There are other considerations that might influence their final decision." Camilla looked up at her private secretary, seeing something in Margaret's eyes that sparked a glimmer of hope.
"What kind of considerations?" "Public opinion, for one. The statement about your transition would need to be carefully crafted to avoid any suggestion of impropriety or forced retirement.
The press would scrutinize every word, every implication."
Margaret was right.
The media that had once tormented Camilla had, over the years, developed a grudging respect for her work and dedication. A poorly handled announcement about her future could easily backfire, creating exactly the kind of controversy the council was trying to avoid. "And there are the Commonwealth realms to consider," Margaret continued. "Many of the governors-general have specifically praised your work with their charitable organizations. A sudden departure might raise questions about the stability of the monarchy during this transition period." As the evening deepened, Camilla began to see the outlines of a strategy forming in Margaret's careful words. This was not over. The council's recommendation was just that, a recommendation. She was still queen, still possessed of the dignity and authority that Charles had helped her claim. The statement they wanted to release could be shaped, modified, or even rejected entirely if she had the courage to fight for her place. The thought of Scotland still weighed heavily on her mind, but now it was accompanied by something else, determination. She had not come this far, weathered this much criticism and doubt, only to be gently pushed aside when it became convenient for others. If there was to be a statement about Queen Camilla's future role, she would have a say in writing it. As she finally rose from her chair, Camilla felt the familiar steel entering her spine that had carried her through decades of public scrutiny. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations with William about his vision for the monarchy, new negotiations with the council about her place within it. But tonight, she would return to her chambers and begin planning her response to their carefully worded suggestion. The roses outside her window would still be there in the morning, and so would she, ready to tend whatever garden needed her attention most. The royal family's statement about Queen Camilla's future role would indeed be released, but it might not contain the words the palace council expected to write. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Windsor Castle.
Princess Anne arrived unannounced, her practical Range Rover crunching up the gravel drive just as Camilla was finishing her morning tea. Through her window, Camilla watched Charles's sister emerge from the vehicle with characteristic brisk efficiency, her gray hair caught by the wind and her expression unreadable. Margaret appeared at the door within minutes. "Your Majesty, the Princess Royal requests an immediate audience. She says it's regarding the council's proposals."
Camilla felt her pulse quicken. Anne had always been the most forthright member of the royal family, never one to soften difficult truths or engage in diplomatic niceties when direct conversation would suffice. If she had come about the Scotland proposal, it meant the news had already spread beyond the immediate circle of the palace council. "Send her up, Margaret. And, perhaps some fresh tea." When Anne entered the morning room, she dispensed with formal protocol, settling into the chair across from Camilla with the easy familiarity of someone who had known grief and understood the weight of unwanted decisions. "I assume you know why I'm here," Anne said without preamble, her direct gaze meeting Camilla's.
"William spoke with me last night about the council's recommendation. I told him he was being a fool."
The bluntness of the statement should have shocked Camilla, but, instead, she felt relief wash over her. Here, finally, was someone willing to speak plainly about the situation. "The boy means well," Anne continued, accepting a cup of tea from Margaret before the private secretary discreetly withdrew. "But he's listening to the wrong voices. The palace council sees you as a complication to be managed rather than an asset to be valued." Camilla set down her own teacup, her hands steadier than they had been in days.
"And what do you see, Anne?"
"I see a woman who spent 20 years learning this job the hard way, who earned her place through service rather than inheritance. I see someone my brother loved enough to fight for, which should count for something in this family."
The validation was unexpected and powerful.
And had never been effusive in her support, but she had watched Camilla's evolution from controversial figure to dedicated royal with the analytical eye of someone who understood the demands of royal duty. "William thinks he needs to distance himself from anything that might remind the public of the difficulties of his father's reign," and explained, stirring honey into her tea with methodical precision. "He's wrong, of course. The public has moved on from those old scandals. They judge you now on your work, not your past."
Camilla leaned forward. "Then, why does the council believe this transition is necessary?" "Because they're looking at polling data instead of human beings. They're reading focus groups instead of understanding the actual relationship between the monarchy and the people."
Anne's voice carried the frustration of someone who had spent decades watching well-meaning advisors misread public sentiment.
Margaret returned quietly, carrying a folder of papers. "Your Majesty, I've prepared some information you might find useful."
She placed the folder on the table between the two women. "Recent survey data about public perception of your role, letters from Commonwealth organizations, and correspondence from charitable institutions."
And gestured toward the folder. "Show me what they're not telling you."
As they reviewed the documents together, a different picture emerged from the one painted by the Palace Council. Letters from heads of state praising Camilla's work. Statistics showing increased support for her role over the past 5 years. Reports from charitable organizations describing the tangible impact of her patronage. "Look at this," Anne said, pointing to a letter from the Governor-General of Canada. "He specifically mentions how your visit last year strengthened Commonwealth ties. And, here, from the Prime Minister of New Zealand, thanking you for your work with literacy programs." The evidence was overwhelming. Rather than being a liability, Camilla had become an integral part of the monarchy's soft power, particularly in the Commonwealth realms where her personal style and genuine engagement had won over initially skeptical populations. The council is advising William based on outdated assumptions, and concluded.
"They're trying to solve a problem that no longer exists."
Margaret cleared her throat gently.
"Your Majesty, there's something else. I've been in contact with some of my colleagues in other royal households. The recommendation for your transition has raised eyebrows among several European monarchies. They see it as a destabilizing precedent."
This revelation added another layer to the complexity of the situation. The British monarchy didn't exist in isolation, its decisions rippled through the interconnected web of European royal families and, constitutional monarchies worldwide. A forced transition could be seen as a sign of weakness or instability at a time when the institution needed to project confidence. Anne stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where gardeners were preparing the rose beds for winter. "I have a proposal," she said without turning around. "Rather than accepting or rejecting the council's recommendation outright, why don't we offer them an alternative?" Camilla joined her at the window. "What kind of alternative?" "A redefinition of your role rather than a retirement from it. You keep your position and duties but expand them in new directions. Focus more heavily on Commonwealth work, perhaps establish a new foundation for international literacy programs. Give William the modernization he wants while maintaining your place in the structure." The idea had merit. Instead of being pushed into a corner, Camilla could proactively reshape her role to address the concerns about modernization while demonstrating her continued value to the institution. It would need careful presentation, Margaret observed from across the room. The statement would have to emphasize evolution rather than revolution, continuity rather than disruption. And turned from the window, her expression determined. "I'll speak with William again." Not as his aunt offering advice, but as the Princess Royal presenting an alternative strategy developed by experienced members of the family. The rest of the morning was spent developing the framework for this alternative approach. They identified specific Commonwealth realms where Camilla's enhanced role could have immediate impact. They outlined charitable initiatives that would address contemporary concerns while building on her existing patronages. Most importantly, they crafted a narrative that positioned the changes as forward-looking leadership rather than defensive reaction to criticism. By afternoon, Anne had arranged a private meeting with William at Kensington Palace. Margaret spent the time preparing detailed briefing documents that demonstrated the international implications of the Council's original recommendation. Camilla found herself in the unusual position of preparing to lobby for her own job, but she approached the task with growing confidence. The call came just after 4 o'clock. William wanted to meet with Camilla directly, at Windsor Castle, that evening. And would accompany him, along with his private secretary, but the Palace Council would not be present. It would be a family conversation rather than a formal proceeding. As evening approached, Camilla chose her outfit carefully. Not too formal, which might suggest she was taking the matter too seriously, but not too casual, which might imply she didn't understand the gravity of the situation. She settled on a navy dress that Charles had always liked, paired with the pearl necklace that had belonged to the Queen Mother. William arrived precisely on time, his usual punctuality accompanied by an expression that revealed nothing of his intentions. He embraced Camilla with genuine warmth, but she could sense the weight he was carrying. The crown was still new to him, its responsibilities still being measured and understood. They gathered in the Oak Room, a smaller, more intimate space than the formal drawing rooms where official business was usually conducted. And had chosen the location deliberately, wanting the conversation to feel like a family discussion rather than a royal proceeding. "Camilla," William began, using her name rather than her title, "I want you to know that the Council's recommendation doesn't reflect my personal feelings about your service or your place in this family." She nodded, recognizing the care he was taking to separate institutional concerns from personal relationships. "I understand the pressures you're facing, William. The desire to establish your own approach to the monarchy is entirely natural. The problem is that I'm being advised to make decisions based on what people think they remember rather than what's actually happening now," William continued. "And has shown me some information that suggests the Council's assessment might be incomplete." Margaret had prepared well. The briefing documents Anne had shared with William clearly demonstrated that public perception had evolved significantly over the past decade. The woman who had once been seen as a threat to the monarchy was now viewed as one of its most dedicated servants. "I've been thinking about your suggestion for redefining rather than retiring," William said, addressing Anne. "It has possibilities, but it would need to be implemented carefully to avoid any suggestion that we're responding to external pressure." Anne leaned forward. "The key is to present it as strategic evolution rather than defensive maneuvering. Camilla has proven skills in Commonwealth engagement and charitable leadership. Building on those strengths serves the monarchy's interests while addressing concerns about modernization." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with all parties working through the practical implications of various approaches. William proved to be more thoughtful and flexible than the council's rigid recommendation had suggested. He genuinely wanted to find a solution that honored Camilla's service while positioning the monarchy for future success. As the evening drew to a close, a consensus began to emerge. Rather than forced retirement or unchanged status quo, they would develop a hybrid approach that expanded Camilla's international role while maintaining her domestic presence. The statement that would be released would announce new initiatives rather than endings, opportunities rather than limitations. William stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Camilla, I want you to know that Charles would be proud of how you're handling this situation. He always said you had more steel in your spine than people realized." After William and departed, Camilla remained in the Oak Room with Margaret, both women feeling cautiously optimistic about the evening's developments.
"It's not over yet," Margaret warned.
"The Palace Council will need to approve any alternative proposal, and some of them are quite invested in their original recommendation." Camilla smiled, feeling more like herself than she had in weeks. "Then, we'd better make sure our proposal is too good to refuse."
The battle for Queen Camilla's future role was far from over, but the terms of engagement had shifted dramatically.
Instead of defending herself against removal, she would be advocating for expansion. Instead of accepting exile, she would be proposing enhanced service. The royal family's statement, when it was finally released, would tell a very different story than the one originally envisioned by the Palace Council. The emergency session of the Palace Council convened 3 days later in the imposing throne room at Buckingham Palace, a deliberate choice of venue that emphasized the gravity of the situation. Lord Pemberton had called the meeting after learning about the alternative proposal that had emerged from the private family discussions at Windsor Castle. Camilla arrived accompanied by Margaret and a new ally, Sir David Richardson, former ambassador to France and a respected voice in diplomatic circles, and had suggested bringing Sir David as an independent expert who could speak to the international implications of the monarchy's decisions without being dismissed as a family partisan. The atmosphere in the room was noticeably tenser than it had been during the initial meeting. Several council members wore expressions of barely concealed irritation at having their carefully crafted recommendation challenged so directly. Lord Pemberton, in particular, seemed to view the alternative proposal as a personal affront to his judgment.
"Your Majesty," Lord Pemberton began with stiff formality, "we have reviewed the alternative framework presented by His Majesty and the Princess Royal. While we appreciate the thoughtfulness behind these suggestions, we have concerns about their practical implementation and long-term implications." Camilla had expected resistance, but she was better prepared now. The past 3 days had been spent refining the proposal with input from Margaret's network of palace communications experts and Sir David's understanding of international protocol. "Lord Pemberton, I appreciate the Council's concerns. Perhaps we could address them systematically," Camilla responded, her voice carrying newfound authority. "Sir David has prepared an analysis of how similar role expansions have been handled by other monarchies." Sir David rose from his seat, his diplomats bearing commanding attention. "Lord Pemberton, members of the Council, I've had the opportunity to consult with my counterparts in several European capitals. The international community is watching this transition carefully, not just for what it reveals about British constitutional practice, but for the precedent it might set for other monarchies facing similar modernization challenges." He opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a set of documents. The Norwegian royal family successfully redefined Crown Princess Mette-Marit's role following public controversies early in her tenure. The Swedish monarchy expanded Crown Princess Victoria's international responsibilities to strengthen Commonwealth-style relationships with former territories. In both cases, the key was evolution rather than elimination. Lady Fitzwilliam, who had seemed more sympathetic during the previous meeting, leaned forward. "Sir David, are you suggesting that the original recommendation would be viewed negatively by our international partners?" "I'm suggesting that sudden changes to established royal roles, particularly those that might be perceived as involuntary, can create uncertainty about institutional stability," Sir David replied diplomatically. "Several governors-general have privately expressed confusion about reports of Queen Camilla's potential retirement, given her effective engagement with their nations." This revelation caused visible discomfort among several council members.
The Commonwealth relationships were a cornerstone of the monarchy's contemporary relevance, and any suggestion that those relationships might be damaged by internal restructuring was taken seriously. Margaret stepped forward with a carefully prepared presentation. My lords and ladies, we've prepared a detailed comparison of public engagement metrics over the past 5 years. The data suggests that Queen Camilla's favorability ratings have steadily improved, particularly in the Commonwealth realms where her personal style has proven effective. The charts and graphs that Margaret displayed told a compelling story. Media coverage had shifted from critical to neutral to increasingly positive. Public appearances drew larger crowds and more positive response. Most significantly, charitable organizations under Camilla's patronage had seen increased donations and volunteer participation. These metrics suggest that the concerns driving the original recommendation may be based on outdated assessments, Margaret continued.
The Queen Camilla of 2025 is not the same figure who generated controversy decades ago.
Lord Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair.
While we acknowledge the improvement in public perception, we must consider the new king's need to establish his own identity and approach to the monarchy. This gave Camilla the opening she had been waiting for.
Lord Pemberton, I believe we share the same goal, supporting His Majesty in establishing a successful and modern approach to royal service. The question is whether that goal is better served by removing experienced voices or by channeling their experience in new directions. She stood and walked to the large windows overlooking the palace gardens, where tourists were visible taking photographs through the iron gates. Those people outside represent the public whose support we all seek to maintain.
They don't see the monarchy as a collection of competing interests or hierarchical positioning.
They see it as an institution that either serves their values and aspirations or fails to do so. Turning back to face the council, Camilla continued with growing confidence.
My proposal doesn't challenge His Majesty's authority or vision.
It supports them by taking on responsibilities that complement his focus on environmental issues and technological innovation. International literacy programs and Commonwealth cultural exchanges don't compete with his initiatives, they enhance the monarchy's overall impact. Sir David nodded approvingly. Your Majesty raises an important point about complementary rather than competitive roles. The most successful royal families have learned to leverage the unique strengths of different members rather than forcing them into identical templates. The discussion that followed was more substantive than the previous council meetings. Individual members raised specific concerns about protocol, resource allocation, and public messaging, but these were practical questions rather than fundamental objections. The tone had shifted from resistance to negotiation. Lady Thornberry, the senior female member of the council, asked a particularly pointed question.
Your Majesty, how do we ensure that an expanded international role doesn't create confusion about the hierarchy of royal representation? His Majesty must be seen as the primary voice of the crown. An excellent question, Camilla responded.
The framework we're proposing specifically positions my expanded role as serving under His Majesty's overall direction. I would be implementing his vision for Commonwealth engagement rather than developing independent policies. Margaret produced another set of documents.
We've prepared detailed protocols for coordination between royal household staff to ensure consistent messaging and appropriate consultation on all international engagements.
The meeting continued for another hour, with council members gradually warming to the alternative proposal as its practical details became clearer. The framework addressed their concerns about hierarchy and consistency while offering genuine benefits in terms of enhanced royal presence in key international relationships. When Lord Pemberton finally called for a brief recess, the mood in the room had changed significantly. Instead of a group determined to implement a predetermined solution, the council had become a working committee refining a collaborative approach. During the break, Camilla found herself in conversation with several council members who had previously seemed firmly committed to the Scotland retirement plan.
Lady Fitzwilliam, in particular, expressed grudging admiration for the thoroughness of the alternative proposal.
Your Majesty, I must admit that your framework addresses most of the concerns that drove our original recommendation, she acknowledged. The international component, particularly, offers opportunities for the monarchy that we hadn't fully considered. Sir David used the break to circulate additional documentation he had prepared about successful royal role transitions in other countries. His diplomatic credentials carried weight with council members who might have dismissed similar arguments coming from palace insiders. When the meeting reconvened, Lord Pemberton's demeanour had noticeably softened. "Your Majesty, the Council appreciates the comprehensive nature of your alternative proposal. We would like to recommend a trial period for implementation, with regular review of its effectiveness." This was more progress than Camilla had dared to hope for. A trial period was far better than forced retirement, and it provided opportunities to demonstrate the value of the expanded role through actual results rather than theoretical arguments. "I welcome the Council's willingness to consider this approach," Camilla responded. "What time frame were you thinking for the trial period?" 18 months, suggested Lady Fitzwilliam. "Long enough to implement several significant initiatives and measure their impact, but not so long that course corrections would be difficult if needed." The remainder of the meeting was devoted to practical details, budget allocations, staff assignments, reporting structures, and communication protocols. Margaret took careful notes, already planning the implementation strategy that would transform the proposal from document to reality. As the session concluded, Lord Pemberton approached Camilla with something resembling warmth in his formal manner. "Your Majesty, I hope you understand that our original recommendation came from genuine concern for the monarchy's welfare. Your alternative proposal demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking that serves the crown well." Walking back to her car through the palace courtyard, Camilla felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The battle wasn't entirely won, the trial period would require careful execution and measurable success, but the immediate threat of exile to Scotland had been replaced by an opportunity to expand her contribution to the institution she had grown to love. Margaret walked beside her, already making mental lists of the work ahead. "Your Majesty, we'll need to begin planning the announcement of your expanded role immediately. The statement will need to strike exactly the right tone, forward-looking without seeming reactive, ambitious without appearing threatening. And, Margaret," Camilla added with a smile, "we'll need to send thank you notes to Anne and Sir David. This victory belongs to all of us." As their car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, Camilla looked back at the building that housed so much history and tradition. Soon it would also house a new chapter in her own story, one that she had helped write rather than simply endured. The royal family's statement about Queen Camilla's future role would indeed be released, but it would announce expansion rather than exile, opportunity rather than ending. 6 months after the Council's agreement to the trial period, Camilla stood on the steps of Government House in Ottawa, watching as hundreds of Canadian schoolchildren waved small Union Jacks and maple leaf flags in the crisp autumn air. The International Literacy Summit she had organized was exceeding all expectations, with education ministers from 12 Commonwealth nations gathered to sign a historic agreement on cross-border educational exchanges. Margaret approached with a tablet displaying the latest media coverage. "Your Majesty, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. The BBC is calling it a masterclass in soft diplomacy, and the Canadian Prime Minister's office has issued a statement praising the initiative as exactly the kind of Commonwealth leadership they had hoped to see. The transformation over the past months had been remarkable. What had begun as a defensive strategy to avoid exile had evolved into a genuine expansion of royal influence and effectiveness. The expanded role wasn't just succeeding, it was demonstrating new possibilities for how the monarchy could serve in the 21st century. The morning's ceremonial signing was followed by a private lunch with the education ministers, where Camilla found herself at the center of substantive policy discussions about literacy rates, teacher training, and digital education access. These weren't ceremonial conversations but real working sessions where her questions and suggestions carried weight. "Your Majesty," said Dr. Patricia Williams, Jamaica's Minister of Education, "the framework you've proposed for teacher exchanges between our nations could address some of our most pressing challenges. We have excellent primary educators who could learn advanced techniques in the UK, while our music and arts specialists could enrich British curricula." These were the kinds of concrete outcomes that made the expanded role meaningful rather than merely symbolic. Instead of cutting ribbons and making polite conversation, Camilla was facilitating real connections that would improve education for thousands of children across the Commonwealth. During a quiet moment between meetings, Camilla's phone buzzed with a text message from William. The sight of his name on the screen still caused a small flutter of anxiety, a residual effect from the months of uncertainty about her future.
Watching the coverage from Ottawa. Dad would have been proud. Well done, Camilla.
The message was brief but heartfelt, representing a relationship that had grown stronger as William witnessed the success of the expanded role. The initial skepticism from palace staff had gradually given way to genuine enthusiasm as the international benefits became apparent. That evening's state dinner provided another opportunity to assess the success of the new approach. Seated between the Governor-General and the Canadian Prime Minister, Camilla found herself discussing everything from Arctic sovereignty to sustainable development goals. The conversations were substantial and informed, a far cry from the purely ceremonial interactions that had characterized many royal engagements in the past. "Your Majesty," the Prime Minister said during the main course, "I hope you know how much we appreciate your genuine engagement with these issues. Too often, international relationships operate at such high levels of abstraction that the human element gets lost. Your approach brings authenticity to diplomatic connections." After dinner, Camilla and Margaret retreated to the quiet of her suite at the Château Laurier to review the day's outcomes and plan the next phase of activities. The Literacy Summit has generated commitments for over £50 million in new educational funding across the participating nations, Margaret reported, reading from her tablet. 3 new university partnerships have been established, and 5 countries have committed to implementing the teacher exchange program within the next academic year. These weren't just impressive statistics, they represented real change in the lives of real people. The expanded role was producing measurable benefits that justified the resources invested and validated the strategy that had emerged from those difficult council meetings. "Margaret, I've been thinking about the next initiative," Camilla said, settling into a comfortable chair by the window overlooking the Ottawa River. "The success here suggests we might be ready for something even more ambitious." "What did you have in mind, Your Majesty?" "A Commonwealth Cultural Heritage Trust. Something that would preserve traditional arts and crafts while creating economic opportunities for artisans in developing nations. We could establish workshops in the UK where master craftspeople from across the Commonwealth could teach their skills while learning new techniques." Margaret made notes as Camilla outlined her vision. This was how the expanded role was supposed to work, building on successful initiatives to create even greater impact while strengthening the ties that bound the Commonwealth together. The flight back to London provided time for reflection on how dramatically circumstances had changed since those dark days when retirement to Scotland had seemed inevitable. The woman who had once been seen as the monarchy's greatest liability was now pioneering its most successful international outreach programs. Landing at Heathrow, Camilla was surprised to see and waiting at the VIP terminal, her practical demeanor brightened by what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "I thought you might like to know," and said without preamble as they walked to the waiting car, "that the Palace Council has voted unanimously to recommend that your trial period be converted to a permanent arrangement. Lord Pemberton specifically asked me to convey his apologies for underestimating the potential of your expanded role." The news was gratifying, but Camilla found that her strongest emotion wasn't relief or vindication. It was anticipation for the work ahead. The expanded role had given her a sense of purpose and effectiveness that exceeded her expectations. "And there's something else," and continued with a rare smile. "William wants to discuss expanding the model to other family members. He's been watching your success and thinking about how Harry might be brought back into active service through a similar international focus." This possibility opened entirely new horizons. If the approach that had saved Camilla's role could also provide a path for Harry's return to royal duties, it might represent a fundamental shift in how the monarchy adapted to contemporary challenges. Arriving back at Windsor Castle that evening, Camilla was greeted by dozens of congratulatory messages from colleagues, friends, and international partners. But the message that meant the most was a handwritten note from William that Margaret had placed on her desk. "Camilla, your success in Ottawa demonstrates what I had hoped but hadn't dared to expect, that evolution rather than elimination can make our institution stronger. The Commonwealth relationships you're building will serve this country for decades to come. Thank you for your service, and for showing us new ways to serve. With respect and affection, William." Standing in her study at Windsor Castle, Surrounded by the evidence of 6 months of successful international engagement, Camilla felt a deep sense of completion. Not the ending of her story, but the completion of a transformation that had taken decades to achieve. The woman who had begun as an outsider fighting for acceptance had become an innovator, showing the monarchy new ways to remain relevant. The role that had once seemed threatened by her past had been expanded because of her proven abilities. The institution that had once viewed her with suspicion now looked to her example for guidance on contemporary royal service. Margaret appeared in the doorway with a final message of the day. Your Majesty, the palace has confirmed that the official statement about your permanent expanded role will be released tomorrow morning. They'd like your approval of the final text. Reading through the statement that would be sent to media outlets around the world, Camilla smiled at how different it was from the retirement announcement that had once seemed inevitable. Instead of forced endings, it spoke of exciting beginnings. Instead of stepping back, it announced stepping forward into even greater service. Her Majesty Queen Camilla will expand her international role to encompass enhanced Commonwealth engagement and cultural diplomacy, building on the remarkable success of recent initiatives including the International Literacy Summit and proposed Commonwealth Cultural Heritage Trust. This expansion reflects both Her Majesty's proven effectiveness in international relations and the royal family's commitment to strengthening ties with Commonwealth partners through meaningful, collaborative programs. The statement continued with details about specific initiatives and their measurable impacts, but Camilla found her attention drawn to the larger implications. This wasn't just about her personal vindication or even her expanded duties. It was about the monarchy proving its capacity to adapt and evolve, to find new ways of serving in a changing world. As she approved the final text and prepared for bed, Camilla reflected on the journey from that morning 6 months earlier when exile to Scotland had seemed certain. The transformation hadn't just been in her circumstances, but in her understanding of her own capabilities and the institution she served. The royal family's statement about Queen Camilla's future role would be released the next morning, but its real impact had already been felt in the Canadian classrooms that would benefit from new educational exchanges, the Commonwealth partnerships that had been strengthened, and the precedent that had been established for adaptive, responsive royal service. Looking out her bedroom window at the rose gardens where this chapter of her story had begun, Camilla saw not just the flowers that had witnessed her moments of doubt, but the symbol of careful tending producing lasting beauty. The monarchy, like the gardens, flourished when it was nurtured with patience, wisdom, and the courage to grow in new directions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight she could rest in the satisfaction of a battle won not through conflict but through demonstration of value, not through political maneuvering but through genuine service to the institution and the people it served. The Queen Camilla who would wake to read the official announcement of her expanded role was the same woman who had fought for her place in this family, but she was also something new, a royal innovator whose success had opened possibilities that neither supporters nor critics had imagined possible.